Dear Dr. Thomas Phillips, lecturer in law and supporter of the peace in Kurdistan campaign. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. What do you consider to be the significance of the HDP in Turkey? Why do you think Turkey is pursuing such as aggressive policy against the Kurds? And how would you comment on the latest killing of the HDP member Deniz Poyraz?
Okay, so the murder of Deniz Poyraz, of course, was carried out by a lone gunman who, well, actually, no, it was a collection of gunmen. And this one in particular was able to get into the HDP's offices in Izmir and brutally murder Deniz Poyraz, who at the time was covering her mother's shift in the HDP offices. And it later transpired that this gunman, who I won't name because I don't want to give him more publicity, would have killed many more people inside the office if it had been possible for him to do so. But as it turns out, it was only the one worker in the HDP office that he was able to murder. So I express my condolences to Deniz's family and my solidarity with the HDP in Turkey more broadly. Now, I think a bit more should be said about this because the spokesperson for the ruling AKP party in Turkey has said, of course, they condemn this brutal killing, they condemn this lone murderer, and they make it sound like this is just an isolated incident of one crazy person who has disrupted social peace. So we're supposed to believe that the whole problem is based on the shoulders of this one person who has completely acted out and murdered somebody. But I think the truth of the matter is more complicated than that. And I think what's actually happened is that the ruling party, the AKP, in collaboration with its partner, the MHP, which is a far-right party, and together they form basically a national front government. They collectively, over the years since the peace process was ended, have created a hostile environment for not just the HDP in Turkey, but for the Kurdish people more broadly, through their constant attacks on the HDP and on the Kurds, through their inability to understand legitimate Kurdish claims and grievances as anything other than violence and terrorism, have created a swamp of hatred and of racism, out of which has crawled this murderer of Deniz Poyraz. So I think we need to get that straight. This is not just one lone individual who has acted out. This is part of a broader campaign against the Kurdish people and a swamp of racism and hatred. I think perhaps the second part of the question was, why is Turkey pursuing such an aggressive policy, which perhaps brings us on to the events in Bashur in South Kurdistan. And of course, what's happening there is that the Turkish army and the Turkish military is moving into towns and villages in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, they say in pursuit of the PKK. And that in doing so, they are occupying towns and villages. The locals who live in those areas are, of course, moving out. And then, the big question there, of course, is whether or not they will ever be able to move back in again. Because we've seen from Turkey's actions in northern Syria or Rojava, in places like Afrin, for example, that once the Turkish army moves in to one of these areas, they tend not to move back out again. And they tend to initiate what we could perhaps call a policy of ethnic cleansing in those areas. So it's possible that in the medium to long term, that's what Turkey's goal is in parts of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And for Turkey, of course, that means control over a whole border area stretching from the end of Syria right the way through to Iran. Now, the question is, why is Turkey pursuing such an aggressive policy against the Kurds? And I think there are perhaps a number of reasons why this is so. The first one is maybe a little obvious, and it's about the long-standing hostility that Turkey has had towards any Kurdish claims whatsoever. Whenever the Kurds look like they might possibly achieve some broader aims, whether it be education in their own language or some kind of political control over the territories that they have inhabited for a long time, that tends to be met with some form of violence from the Turkish state. And that's a long story that goes way back. And in some sense, this is simply a continuation of it. We also have the fact that the current president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan, is quite openly on the record as longing for a lost empire, namely the Ottoman Empire, and the parts of Syria and the parts of Iraq that were formerly under the control of the Ottoman Empire. So for him to send the army into parts of northern Syria and the Kurdistan region of Iraq and to take control of those parts of the land is a step forwards in recapturing at least some of the former Ottoman Empire. And the other way, of course, that can be done is through having clients in place, such as the Kurdistan Democratic Party, the KDP, that it feels it can control. Very briefly, I think the other main reason is domestic politics, of course. Because Mr. Erdogan's party is losing popularity in Turkey due to economic problems and due to its growing authoritarianism, it's found itself in an alliance with an ultra right-wing, if not fascist party called the MHP. And one way to gather support for this National Front government is, of course, to go after the Kurds. That's one thing that's guaranteed to win votes in that particular alliance and to please the MHP.
Thank you. In the long term, what should be done to resolve the so-called Kurdish question? Very short, very briefly, please.
Okay. In the long run, I think we should really just go back to the peace process that was in place before everything broke down in around 2015. So as you'll recall, there was a peace process going on. There was a ceasefire. And there was a statement that was made after negotiations. It's called the Dolmabahce Agreement. And it said in brief that there should be a democratic resolution to the so-called Kurdish question, and that there should be some sort of pluralism in Turkey, room for people with different identities, not just the one monolithic Turkish identity. And that would inevitably include addressing some of the legitimate grievances that Kurdish people have, particularly in Turkey now. That's the focus. The first thing that they ask for that's perfectly legitimate is some sort of localized democracy, whether that's autonomy, like you find in Spain, or whether it's just more power for local municipalities to control their own affairs. That's one major demand that could be dealt with and could be negotiated. There are also cultural policies, such as having Kurdish language education in schools in Turkey, so children can go to school and learn in their own language. There are economic policies that could be developed to end the deliberate de-development of the Kurdistan region in Turkey. And in effect, the government in Turkey could just make a conscious decision to stop viewing the Kurdish question as purely a security issue, as purely a question of violence and terrorism. And instead, it could be understood, as it has in the past, that there are legitimate grievances here that need to be dealt with. And this is nothing new. It's been done before in Northern Ireland and in other places, in other contexts.
Dear Dr. Thomas Phillips, thanks for joining us. Thank you for your valuable comments today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.